Beavers have been released back into the wild in Essex for the first time in 400 years. It's been done not because they're cute, although they are, but because they've got an important job to do, working as flood engineers.
What you're about to see looks impossible, and even scientists were stunned. There's a certain kind of silence that doesn't sound empty. It feels empty. Stand beside one of Scotland's engineered rivers, and you can sense it. The water moves, but it doesn't live. A river once declared lifeless by engineers, bulldozed into straight channels and stripped of life, is now a thriving wetland ecosystem. Scotland released just 11 beavers into it. 11 animals rewrote centuries of water management, boosting biodiversity, trapping sediment, and even taming floods in ways modern science couldn't predict. 15 years later, what happened next didn't just surprise scientists, it humbled them. But how did a handful of beavers rewrite an entire river system? The audacious decision to release the 11. In 2009, Knapdale Forest in Scotland hid a mystery that few people could have imagined. The River Erne, which used to be a proud waterway, now flows across the countryside as a shallow, lifeless channel. Its banks have been scraped and scarred by years of human activity. Engineers had straightened it, drained wetlands, and demolished curves in the sake of control. But it was a river that had lost its spirit. In this context, a small group from the Scottish Wildlife Trust got together for an act that many people labeled bold or even stupid. Scotland had not seen beavers in 400 years. Fur dealers, hunters, and developers had started a war on the species, wiping it out of rivers and people's minds. And now, conservationists were going to go against hundreds of years of absence and bring 11 Norwegian beavers to a place that had forgotten how smart they were. It was a risk that needed more than bravery. It needed rigorous planning, legal battles, and an almost obsessive faith in nature. It had taken a long time to do. Legal fights had put the project on hold for years. Farmers were anxious about flooded fields, fishermen were worried about salmon runs, and local authorities were hesitant to approve an animal that had long been called a pest. There were a lot of environmental impact studies that showed how beavers might change the landscape by slowing down the flow of water, trapping silt, creating wetlands, and supporting hundreds of species. But no model could say what would happen in a Scottish river that had been scoured bare for hundreds of years. Some people thought this experiment would fail because the animals would vanish, be hunted, or simply not survive. 11 people, including 3 families from Norway, were put in quarantine, watched, and carefully checked out. Each one held the hopes of an entire ecosystem on its shoulders. Their orange teeth and paddle-shaped tails hid a force that seemed almost magical, the power to change rivers, change landscapes, and even change life itself. There was no fanfare when they got there. There were no crowds or cheering, just the silent river, the subtle hiss of the autumn wind, and the cautious eyes of scientists and rangers. And then it occurred. The beavers were let go into the Knapdale streams one at a time. They were small, hairy, and seemed weak, but they explored their new habitat with a strong will. They sniffed the banks, looked at possible dam sites, and eventually left behind small signs of their presence, such gas-gnawed saplings, mud that had been shifted around, and minor changes in the water. At first, it was very subtle, nearly imperceptible. But for those who understood what to look for, it was amazing. People in the community didn't stop being skeptical right away. Farmers walked around their fields to look for indications of water. People who fish looked at the murky water, worried about salmon. Engineers shook their heads because they had learned over the years that rivers follow strict rules of physics and that dikes, weirs, and dredging were the only ways to control flow. But the scientists who were filming the release noticed the first signs of something else. A quiet intelligence at work, nature taking back what people had sought to control. This wasn't merely an experiment in ecology, it was a test of how humble you are. The crew knew what was at stake. 11 animals had to show that life might change what people thought they knew. Cameras caught every moment, from the first tentative dives into the sea to the careful building of the first cottages. People who were watching whispered, "Will it last? Are they going to make it?" But deep down, everyone felt the stress of seeing a river that had been pronounced lifeless come back to life. The first dams. What happened next was more than anyone could have thought. The beavers, slowly and without anyone noticing, started to change a Knapdale forest. Dams were made out of mud and branches. Ponds formed when water collected. Wetlands formed as sediment settled. The river's flow returned to something alive, something that was there before people built things. In the end, scientists would find that these 11 small architects were responsible for huge gains in biodiversity, flood control, and the strength of ecosystems. In 2009, though, all anyone had was faith, a few beavers, and the eerie quiet of a river that had been waiting for its miracle for hundreds of years. The brave choice had been made, and the narrative of how 11 little animals went against all odds, and even rationality, was just getting started. Something amazing started to happen as 2010 rolled around, just a year after the 11 Norwegian beavers moved to Knapdale Forest. At first, it was hard to see. Mud-streaked paws prodding saplings, and water accumulating in small holes were small, quiet movements that didn't look like much to someone who wasn't taught. But for the scientists observing, each movement was a sign of a revolution that was happening right in front of their eyes, one that would change the river in ways that no one expected. People typically think of beavers as just rodents, yet they are actually nature's engineers. Their natural ability to build things is unmatched. They build dams out of branches, twigs, and mud that slow down fast-moving water and store it in ponds that become homes for many different kinds of animals. By the end of the first year, Knapdale had more than 100 little dams. Each one was a tiny victory over years of human interference, a small act of revolt against straightened waterways and drained wetlands. The river started to act differently with each dam. The dams worked like natural barriers, soaking up the rain's power, holding sediment, and stopping damage downstream. Engineers who had been looking at the location for decades were confused. It was impossible for modern hydrological models, which had been carefully calibrated with years of data, to recreate what these 11 small animals had done on their own. The beavers seemed to have figured out a code that humans had been trying to break for hundreds of years. The magic wasn't just in the water. Wetlands grew up behind each dam as ponds formed. They were lush, diverse, and full of life. Amphibians made their homes in muddy banks, while dragonflies flew over quiet water, their wings shining in the Scottish sun. Salmon found calmer waters to spawn in, while birds built nests in the willows that were starting to grow back on the ground that had been flooded. Frogs, newts, spuds, and a lot of other invertebrates moved in since there was so much habitat. Each pond was like a little world, a self-sustaining ecology that was made by instinct instead of engineering books. Pollution, which used to be a quiet threat, started to go down. The dams slowed down the water that was full of silt, which naturally filtered out nutrients and contaminants. The river, which had been quiet for hundreds of years because of human control, started to clean itself, bringing back clarity and harmony that engineers had tried and failed to recreate with concrete channels and other artificial means. The irony was clear. Nature did better than human planning, and it did it with a humility that no machine could ever match. The way people in the community reacted changed slowly but drastically. Farmers who were worried that their meadows would flood began to see small changes for the better. Fish numbers went back up, which brought fishermen back to the riverbanks. People in the area started to talk about a living river where there had just been wounds and nothingness before. Even the naysayers had to stop and think. Not because the beavers were flashy or scary, but because the subtle changes screamed louder than any report, dataset, or argument ever could. There was no denying the change by 2012, 5 years into the trial. The 11 beavers had babies, and their babies built other dams further upstream and in tributaries. At first, it was a precarious experiment, but now it was a full-blown ecological event. The river was no longer a straight, lifeless scar. It was instead a colorful mix of ponds, wetlands, and moving channels, all of which were connected to each other. As time went on, researchers began to refer to it as a quiet revolution. Both the magnitude of the changes and the magnitude of the changes were conveyed through the term. There were a few critters who brought about a change in the management of rivers that lasted for hundreds of years. They established a system that was self-sustaining, robust, and successful in ways that no engineer had ever considered. There was a deeper sense of surprise that no chart could express, and that was the understanding that life could heal itself in ways that were almost magical if it was given room and guidance. This was the case even as the numbers came in. which included water retention rates, flood reduction percentages, and biodiversity counts. Even though the dams were spectacular, the river had yet another surprise in store for us. The genuine miracle was not simply a matter of reducing the speed of the water or preventing floods. Knapdale had been devoid of life for hundreds of years, but thanks to the ingenuity of the beavers, it had been brought back to life. Signs of life that hinted at something more were given off by the frogs that were croaking together at sunset, the dragonflies that were hovering over the mirrored ponds, the salmon that were swimming through clear water, and the birds that were constructing nests in trees that were getting better. There appeared to be more that nature had to teach than anyone had previously believed. It was said in a quiet voice by the scientists that what happened next was beyond anyone's wildest dreams. In fact, it was. Knapdale would never be the same after the Beavers' covert revolution, which was just the beginning of a saga that would forever alter the town. The biodiversity explosion. Salmon, which hadn't been seen in these waters in a long time, now swam freely in the slower currents. Concrete channels and years of human activity made it practically impossible for animals to thrive. But the Beavers' dams gave them safe places to hide and calm ponds. The quantity of salmon grew by 200% in just 5 years. They came back with glittering flashes that danced in the sun, which was confirmation that nature can always heal. Dragonflies, those magnificent summer jewels, swarmed over the ponds in vast clouds, laying eggs in shallow water where their relatives had disappeared. Kingfishers, which hadn't been seen in years, perched on branches that hung low. Their vivid blue feathers were a clear sign that things were returning to normal. The wetland's edges did nicely too. Reed beds grew along the banks, cleaning up runoff by filtering out pollutants and contaminants. Willows and alders also took root in the soft, nutrient-rich soil. These trees were more than just attractive to look at. They also made paths for otters and water voles, which gave them shelter, food, and a new rhythm to the river's life. Lapwings and snipe, two types of birds that hadn't been seen in the area for a long time, returned to the damp meadows to nest. It sounded like Knapdale was singing a tune that had been lost for a long time. 15 years after the beavers came without anybody noticing, the findings stunned even the most expert ecologists. There were a lot more bugs, 400% more, which made it a wonderful feast for birds and frogs. There were twice as many kinds of birds, which made the woods full of sound and activity. The banks of the river were bright green, gold, and in flower in the early summer because there were so many different kinds of plants. This wasn't just getting better. It was a revolt against being neglected for years and a way for people to get back the life they had lost. Beavers put in a lot of effort during the entire process. Unrelenting builders, patient engineers, and architects who labored in the background to develop an ecosystem that some people believed could never be rectified were responsible for its creation. Their dams did a number of things. They slowed down the stream, they collected debris, and they created calm areas where life might flourish. Each and every pond and channel that they excavated, as well as each and every branch that they chewed and wove, transformed into a thread in a tapestry of living strength. By doing so, they were influencing the future of Knapdale on the river. Engineers and hydrologists who had been concerned about the project from the beginning were unable to believe what they saw. It had been demonstrated through computer models, simulations, and decades of data that things would shift gradually and steadily, but not in this manner specifically. The river did not merely improve, rather, it actually altered. Because of the way its wetland areas functioned as natural reservoirs, the maximum flood levels were reduced by as much as 60% in years that received a great deal of precipitation. At the same time, the region became better prepared to deal with droughts. The natural world, in the form of these small, hairy mice, had accomplished more than the human race could comprehend in ways that books could hardly express. The humbling of human engineering. Scotland's rivers had been changed by human engineering with iron will and concrete power. For hundreds of years, straightened rivers cut across valleys, dams caught every potential flow, and fens were drained to make room for farms. At first glance, it seemed like a victory. Order over chaos, control over nature. But the results said something else. Rivers seemed to be fighting back against flash floods. Erosion dug gullies like open wounds, and biodiversity fell as inflexible designs took over. Every winter brought new floods, and every summer brought new droughts. Even though billions were spent on flood barriers, channels, and sluices, The engineers had made things work better, but they were always a step behind nature. Then, the beavers showed up. 11 little, unassuming animals with orange teeth and no weapons stealthily started to outsmart Scotland's biggest buildings. In Knapdale, their dams spread across the river system. Each one was simple, made of woven branches and mud, yet it could change and fix itself. Storms ripped through the forest, but the dams held up. They bent like living structures, taking the pressure and holding water where engineers had failed for a long time. Flood peaks reduced by 30 to 60%. Over the course of 15 years, water retention grew by 60%, and sediment trapping made the water clearer. All of this was done using buildings that didn't need any money, licenses, or cranes, just the cleverness of one species. It was necessary for the scientists and engineers who had been monitoring the project to maintain a humble attitude. There were individuals who worked for the Scottish Environment Protection Agency who stated that their hard infrastructure improvements, which cost several millions of pounds, could not possibly have the same effect as the beavers. "We spent millions on what we thought were the best flood defenses," said one individual. "We were wrong, but the beavers did it for free and better." The lesson struck a chord with me. The so-called inefficiencies that nature exhibits, such as the slow meandering, the pooling of waters, and the ongoing redesigning of channels, are the exact essence of resilience. People had the misconception that the elements that were wasteful, chaotic, or imperfect were essential to their survival. A beaver pond has the ability to store water in a manner that is not possible with concrete walls or straight lines. The philosophical repercussions were significant in their own right. For a long time, engineers had the desire to regulate rivers and make them predictable. They believed that technology and money could outperform the process of evolution, which had taken hundreds of years. On the other hand, amid the tranquil woods of Knapdale, the smallest workers had brought down the most ambitious endeavors of humankind. With each new turn, each new pond, and each new dam, I was reminded that survival, stability, and biodiversity are frequently more successful when they are allowed to adapt to their environment rather than when they are controlled. Not only were these beavers building dams, but they were also revolutionizing the norms of resilience and challenging the pride that has been held by humans for hundreds of years. The transformation was not limited to flooding alone. The stream was slowed down, silt was held, and nutrients were added to the soil along the riverbanks as a result of the presence of willow ponds. Because of this, erosion was cut in half. There was an increase in groundwater levels, which served to defend against droughts during the summer. In order to maintain the flow of water, wetland areas soaked up the winter rains and then gradually released them. All of these solutions had been tried by other people using pumps, sluices, and concrete channels. But the beavers were able to accomplish this without any prior planning, budgeting, or meetings. In each and every respect, nature performed superiorly to engineering. The evidence presented here demonstrates that the complexity that results from millions of years of evolution is frequently more complicated than the complexity that results from boardrooms and laboratories. Despite the fact that it was wonderful, this restoration did not come at no cost. There were moments when flooded fields tested the patience of farmers. Ponds broke through in ways that were unexpected, and fences were submerged in water that moved slowly. Despite the fact that there were arguments, these were not failures, but rather reminders of the price of living together and the trade-offs that must be made when people and wildlife share space. Although the beavers did not perform their duties without flaws, they were quite skilled in their work. When the beavers flooded the fields. Not everyone was happy when the beavers came back, but for some farmers, the magic seemed more like a problem. The river began to flow in different directions as a result of the construction of further dams by beavers along its length. Each of the ponds grew larger. Marshy regions have developed in low-lying fields. The crops that had previously grown in rows were now growing in the confines of little ponds. The grass that the cows were eating became mushy and dirty, and when your family needs that land to make money, muddy fields aren't beautiful, they're frustrating. Farmers in Scotland fought hard for hundreds of years to keep water away. They dug trenches for drainage. They made the streams straight. They made sure rivers flowed quickly so that farms would stay dry. They thought that water that wasn't moving would hurt things. When beavers slowed rivers down on purpose, it felt like someone was erasing years of labor. Then the storms hit. Beaver dams are powerful, yet they are made of mud and sticks. A couple of early dams burst due to severe rain. When that happened, The water that had been held poured out swiftly, bringing muck and trash with it to neighboring land. In 2012, one big breach even broke part of a road in the area. That moment made everything different. The story wasn't about cuddly creatures helping nature anymore. It was about taking chances. Meetings in the community became tense. Some people said the beaver project was dangerous. Some people wanted the animals to be taken away. Some people even called them invasive, even though beavers had lived in Scotland long before humans drained the wetlands. The country was split. On one side were scientists and conservationists who pointed to the numbers: fewer floods downstream, clearer water, and more animals. On the other side, farmers pointed to crops that had been flooded and the money they had lost. They were both right. That was what made it hard. The government of Scotland had to get involved. New laws in 2016 made it possible to manage things in a controlled way. Landowners might get permission to destroy a beaver dam that caused a lot of harm, or, in very exceptional situations, to eliminate certain species. To help farmers get back on their feet after losing money, compensation plans were put in place that paid them about £1,000 per impacted acre. Then, in 2019, beavers were formally named a protected native species. That meant they were no longer merely test subjects. They were back in Scotland. But protection didn't mean disregarding issues. It means figuring out how to keep them in balance. NatureScot and other groups started going to farms, providing workshops, and giving out useful items. Some dams have special flow devices, often known as beaver deceivers, put in place to keep the water levels stable without damaging the structures. Farmers found that some wetlands may help keep the soil hydrated during dry summers. And, little by little, something strange started to happen. The same wetlands that flooded some low fields were also stopping greater floods from happening in other places. Flood insurance claims went down by around 40% in regions where beavers were in charge. During hot summers, crops close to wetlands generally stayed greener longer because the water table was higher. Some farmers, especially those downstream, started to see benefits. Some people even joked that the beavers were working for free. But there are still fights. Some landowners still have trouble expanding their ponds. People still disagree over where beaver populations should develop and where limits should be put in place. There are trade-offs when people strive to fix nature. For hundreds of years, people made rivers go in straight lines because they thought that was the best way to do things. They made the terrain easy to understand. They made it easy to plan. But that efficiency came at a cost. Greater floods, drier summers, and animals that were dying. Beavers brought back curves. Curves signify that water flows out. Curves can make the ground moist at times. Curves mean that things change. Beavers go national. What started as a risky experiment in one quiet Scottish forest didn't stay small for long. By the late 2010s, policymakers could no longer ignore the results. Flood peaks reduced, water retained, biodiversity rebounding, and perhaps most convincing of all, money saved. Natural flood management projects linked to beaver activity were showing measurable economic benefits. Fewer downstream flood claims, less need for emergency engineering, lower long-term maintenance costs. That changed the conversation. Scotland formally granted beavers protected status in 2019. They were no longer an experiment. They were policy. And once that door opened, other parts of the UK began paying attention. In England, the river otter trial in Devon became a landmark case. Initially framed as a limited scientific study, it produced similar results: improved water quality, reduced peak flows, and expanding wetland habitats. Public support grew. Local councils that once resisted began reconsidering. The question shifted from, should we allow this, to, can we afford not to? Across the UK, natural flood management, NFM, moved from the environmental fringe to mainstream policy language. Instead of defaulting to higher walls and deeper channels, agencies began exploring upstream interventions, reconnecting floodplains, restoring wetlands, and, where suitable, allowing beavers to engineer landscapes once more. Why? Because the numbers made sense. Traditional hard infrastructure demands massive upfront investment and continuous maintenance. It degrades, it cracks, it requires upgrades. Beaver-built systems, by contrast, are adaptive. They self-repair. They expand gradually. They evolve with rainfall patterns. Over time, Several UK analyses estimated that nature-based flood management strategies could save millions annually compared to exclusively engineered defenses. Not because concrete doesn't work, but because concrete alone cannot absorb variability. Beavers, strangely enough, could. And so, what began with 11 animals in Knapdale became a blueprint. Licenses expanded. Controlled reintroductions increased. Monitoring programs scaled nationally. But the real shift wasn't just ecological, it was philosophical. For generations, water management followed a command and control model: constrain, accelerate, discharge. The beaver model proposed something different: slow, spread, store. That contrast now sits at the heart of a much bigger question. If slowing water works in rural Scotland, could it work in cities? In London, Thames flood mitigation planning increasingly incorporates wetland restoration, green corridors, and floodplain reconnection, strategies that echo beaver logic, even if no rodents are involved. Urban sponge city models emerging globally, from Rotterdam to parts of East Asia, emphasize retention basins, green roofs, permeable surfaces, and restored marshlands. The pattern is clear. Modern urban resilience is rediscovering what beavers never forgot. Speed amplifies destruction. Slowness diffuses it. This is the beaver paradox. What appears inefficient at small scale becomes profoundly efficient at large scale. 11 beavers in one forest demonstrated how distributed, adaptive systems outperform rigid centralized defenses. Scale that principle to a megacity, and the logic still holds. Because the warming world is not asking whether we prefer nature-based solutions, it is asking whether our existing systems can survive intensifying extremes. Hard infrastructure remains essential. No serious planner is arguing otherwise. But layered resilience, combining engineered defenses with natural absorption, is increasingly seen as the only viable path forward. 11 beavers, one dying river, 15 years later, a blueprint for the future. Scotland didn't just restore a river, it rewrote the rules. If you believe nature might be smarter than we think, hit like, subscribe, and join us for the next untold breakthrough.